This is an RNZ podcast.
They say life is stranger than fiction.
At the moment, it hasn't done anything much more exciting than be a blob of metal that we can thin out into a pancake and then make it move around, stretching itself out across a flat surface and then compress itself back up into a blob.
But sometimes what we see in movies or read in books is so incredible, it obviously couldn't be possible. Or could it?
Spoiler alert, you can't really do it with Mercury. You can't really do it exactly the way it is in the movie yet with anything. But, you know, it's not as impossible as it might seem.
I'm Brian Crump and welcome to Sci Fi, Sci Fact. This week's intersection of science fiction and fact is inspired by the Terminator series of movies. And here to tease out what facts might lie behind this fiction is Duncan McGillvray, McDiarmid Institute Principal Investigator and Professor of Chemical Sciences at Auckland University.
All right, listen. The Terminator's an infiltration unit. Part man, part machine. Underneath, it's a hyperalloy combat chassis. Microprocessor controlled, fully armored, very tough. But outside, it's living human tissue. Flesh, skin, hair, blood, grown for the cyborgs.
I am not stupid, you know. They cannot make things like that yet.
Not yet. Not for about 40 years.
I'll be back.
You know, the Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicle where in Terminator 1 he comes back as the bad robot, and then later on he comes back as the good robot. But now the bad robots, well, they can change form. You can wipe them out, and then the sort of metal forms droplets, and it just reforms the robot again, the bad robot. And for a start, you think, well, what chance does Arnie stand? But Arnie still tends to, spoiler alert, outdo these bad robots. But the other thing is, how could metal reconfigure itself with seemingly no intervention from any other human or machine for that matter? Kia ora, Duncan. Are you a Terminator? Are you an Arnie fan?
Oh, look, absolutely. Arnie does the job of emotionless robot really well. I think that's, clearly true.
Yes.
But Terminator 2 in particular is sort of an iconic movie out of my childhood. Just to date myself, I remember in the summer of my fourth form year when we should have been studying things in class, watching this movie on repeat time after time. So it's really sunk into my memory.
Yeah. So the I've kind of given the basic narrative, but it's Arnie is now the good robot, right? And in Terminator 1, he was the bad robot. But we don't want to talk about Terminator 1 because in Terminator 1, he's just a really amazing with some kind of skeleton that's very hard to destroy. But in the end, you can still destroy it. But in Terminator 2, the bad robots, there's this kind of, you hit them and then the metals, they just reform and come back again. And they keep walking at you with that gleam in their eyes.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. I mean, it's obviously Terminator was a success, but how do you have a sequel to a movie where you've created a robot that, is almost impossible to kill and is Arnold Schwarzenegger and really muscly and bulky? You can't go more muscly and more bulky. It just gets a bit ridiculous. So they went the other way. They decided we'll have a slim, thin actor, and he's going to be the slim, sleek, ultra-modern T1000 next model up. And it's this liquid metal, and he can reconfigure himself to look like whoever he wants, and he can be cut apart and he'll reform.
And this is something which is liquid at room temperature. So straight off, the only metal I know of which has that property is mercury, but then how do you make mercury solid again?
Yeah, well, no, so this is, where the effects ideas come from. A lot of the effects are sort of based around just mercury flowing around. Spoiler alert, you can't really do it with mercury. You can't really do it exactly the way it is in the movie yet with anything. But, it's not as impossible as it might seem. So if we could think of a way of solidifying the metal, and that could be through magnetism, or it could be through electricity, to sort of add a bit of rigidity to the metal. Then we can start to think about liquid when the current is off, and more rigid when the current is on, and then we can start to sort of negotiate our way towards something that's not too far away from a killer robot. At the moment, it is still a long way away, but, we're heading down the path.
So what are some of the things that if a metal was to, say a metal object, such as a robot, was to reform itself after being seriously deformed, what are some of the things we need in that material in order for that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start by saying, if you get two mercury droplets, they will get them close together and they will rapidly combine to make one big droplet again, because mercury has an extremely high surface tension. It doesn't like spreading out. So with mercury, the classic example, it's really hard to do anything that isn't a sphere because that keeps the smallest surface area. So joining things together is not necessarily that hard. What we need to think about is how we can have something that we can shape that doesn't hold itself together so hard that we can't spread it out. And, I guess there's one other problem with mercury in particular. So, we could be focusing on metals for this, but mercury is really dense. So
it's actually really heavy.
Well, heavy for the amount of volume. So it's 14 times denser than water. So in other words, if you have me standing up, I'm 83 kilos in weight. If I were made of mercury and exactly the same size and shape, I'd be over a ton, right? It's just really heavy.
Okay,
exactly.
That could explain why I have no recollection of any Terminator scenes where the bad robot is chasing the good robot or the good guys in the water.
Just sink to the bottom. Yeah, he probably would. Mind you, so would Arnie, actually, to be honest. Underwater.
But surely Arnie's got a bit of plastic that might give him some buoyancy.
And that's sort of the clue to actually where I think we're more likely to get something like this, which is in plastics. Not all plastics are bad, and some of the things that plastics can do that are pretty amazing are be light, be flexible, conduct electricity, and also be self-healing. So I'm even an author on a paper where we're looking at exactly that sort of thing in the conducting polymer space, where you can cut it in half and it will heal itself.
Okay. Can you tell me a bit more about how that works and what you've achieved so far?
Yeah, I mean, what that is polymers are really flexible, not only in terms of actually being flexible and bendable, but also flexible because we can incorporate all sorts of interesting functionality into it. Plastics, polymers are building blocks just stuck together, and depending on which building blocks you put in there, you can get all sorts of different behavior. And so what we need to do is put building blocks in there that if you break the polymer apart, those building blocks want to come back together and recombine. So, it's all about creating a sophisticated enough polymer that is able to do these sorts of things. And the beauty of that, of course, is if you have a conducting polymer, it's a wire. If the wire gets broken, then the wire can rejoin itself and reconnect the electricity again. Very, very good if you're going to be doing wearable electronics or something. Yeah.
When you work in the lab, what have you achieved so far? You snipped a wire and it's rejoined? Something as basic as that?
Exactly that? Yeah, basically it's like that. I mean, so you can produce these very stretchy polymers, and that's really valuable. So you can stretch them out. And if you cut it and have the two ends close to each other, they will rejoin again, and then you can conduct electricity through them again. And it's not just us. I mean, I'd like to say that there's actually a lot of people are working in exactly this kind of space, because that flexibility and self-repairability, we're kind of just stealing from nature, of course. The human body, if you cut your skin, it will reform itself and seal back over again.
See, if I go back and use my trying to remember, particularly the Terminator 2, where it's the slim Terminator 1000, is it? T1000?
T1000.
And there are a couple of things that happen. I think one is that Arnie gives it a good old whack with some great big piece of metal, and or shoots it with a big gun. And you can see the dent marks, you can see the face being pushed back, and then it all reforms. Now, is there anything in terms of either polymers or metals which could possibly do that? And I guess the other thing I'm getting at is that, your normal, even with machines, don't you need some kind of skeleton that everything holds on to? Even if it's not a living body. I mean, we have our bones. In Terminator 1, there's a skeleton. There's that creepy scene where it comes out of the fireball, just the skeleton left in those eyes, those wonderful, gleaming, sinister eyes. Isn't there something that is going to have to form the foundation of this machine?
Yeah, I mean, depending, if you want the kind of sophistication of a machine that walks and reforms itself into the shape of your mother after you've shot it with a shotgun, like happens in the movie, then yes, you're going to need some kind of brain in there. Now that can be a microchip, something that is controlling or understanding. If you want more basic structure, we can have materials that sort of self-assemble into interesting shapes. But if you want to be able to have this adaptability, this reconfigurability, this change from one to another at whim, we need to have something that's doing the whim.
What could we possibly do to a material to allow it or enable it to self-assemble without us using tools, without having to send this thing back to the lab, back in the future and back again, which obviously it doesn't?
Yeah, so the basic self-assembly, there's quite a lot of things that arrange themselves in beautiful patterns without anything in there. But if you wanted something that can be this shape, then that shape, then you're going to need some sort of command sets. That's just a microchip. And then you're going to need some sort of stimulus. And that could be, as I said before, it could be a magnetic stimulus. It could be an electrical stimulus. It could be something. I mean, if you want something that will stand up and be able to slice through things, then it needs to be rigid. It doesn't need to be a skeleton. If we, again, look at nature, there's a whole lot of examples in nature of things that have a very hard outside and then a soft inside, as long as you've got the rigidity there somewhere. So one of the groups that's been working in this space has been taking metal, putting an electrical circuit over it, and it rigidifies the surface. So, it's not yet enough to slice through steel bars, but it's beginning to be able to hold its own weight and have shapes.
Okay, could you tell me a bit more about that one, Duncan?
Yeah, at the moment it hasn't done anything much more exciting than be a blob of metal that we can thin out into a pancake and then make it move around, stretching itself out across a flat surface, and then compress itself back up into a blob. So
okay, and remind me what's the stimulus that's making it move?
In that case, there's two examples. One is a magnetic field and the other is electricity. And of course, with either metals or these conducting polymers, electricity is a really nice one because they intrinsically conduct electricity themselves. So they can, the signal gets all the way to the outside of the material.
So I'm trying to break this down, Duncan. Let's imagine that there is some kind of chip in the machine that is able to, when it is damaged, deformed, or disintegrates, able to send messages out to the metal, some kind of stimulus, electrical stimulus, that enables it to reform. That's one way of looking at it. There was another way I was thinking, and that is, how the human body, the DNA blueprint is in every cell, isn't it? Of our body, yeah. Right. And the various cells know how to form themselves to create the total human. What if we were able to imprint that information into individual metallic molecules so that they knew where they had to go to reform the body, knew what they had to be next to reform the body?
So that's a really interesting analogy, and to be honest, it mirrors. I was having this conversation with my wife. How would we actually make this happen? This idea that you could put the instructions into every bit of the metal. Yes, we could think of ways of doing that just by the intrinsic structure of let's say, the alloy that we use to make the metal or the nature of the polymer. But even in our body, DNA by itself doesn't do anything. It's a book that needs to be read. And that's how viruses work. They are books, but until they're in a cell in your body and there's somebody in there reading them, nothing happens. So we need machinery to be able to read it. So we'd have to think of not only how we have the set of instructions, but also how we have the machines that read all those sets of instructions as well.
And then send the various bits of the machine, possibly in liquid form, back to the right place. So when they solidify, the machine is once again in its original form.
Yep. Yeah. And we'd have to have some sort of sensing in there as well, so that one part knew where the other part was, so that they could flow together. I mean, we're a long way away from making a robot like that, but just the idea that we could shape metals on the fly allows us to think of, electronic devices where the antenna that's in there changes depending on the strength of the signal, or a computer where the circuit board might change depending on the kind of computation you want it to do. We don't have to go and take out that circuit board and put a different one in. We could actually just get it to move around the surface and do a new configuration.
The reason I'm investigating this line of inquiry is because I'm thinking about nanotechnology and our ability to imprint information into smaller and smaller spaces, where maybe we can get down to maybe near the molecular level. And therefore then if each bit of the machine, tiny bit, has the right information, we might have the ability to imprint that into various molecules of the machine.
Yeah, Richard Feynman had a very famous lecture where he says there's plenty of room at the bottom. So, yes, one of the things that people have been doing in nanotechnology is actually getting down to a molecular level and developing machines at this molecular level that can drive themselves to do things. They still need a controlling kind of brain to be able to connect these together to make things happen.
Yeah. And that really maybe is as much of a problem because, okay, I've made the assumption we've got a chip that can store the information, some kind of really clever chip that can survive and can draw the disparate bits of the machine once it's been blasted apart back together again. But it's going to need some kind of way of transmitting signals. As you say, the book has to be read. And how would it do that?
Yeah, and this is us on a journey to kind of recreate life in a way. It's putting pieces together the way that nature does. There is one other piece of the puzzle that we need, and that's energy.
Yes.
Some kind of fuel, some kind of way of drawing energy from the surroundings, something to actually fuel the machines to do the things that they need to do.
Duncan, that is actually a common refrain of mine in a lot of these discussions, which is, you could possibly do it, but you just need to have the energy of a nuclear power station on your back and then harness it. If you could do that, yeah, sure, you'd be fine. You just have to have, Chernobyl on the back, but a functioning Chernobyl as opposed to one that's burying making a great big hole in the ground on its way down to China or Australia or whatever.
This is one of the beauties of going down to the really, really small size, though, because when you're actually really, really small, the amount of energy you need to use is much, much smaller as well. And so then the question is, well, how do you combine lots of little small things together in a way that makes sense?
Well, does that mean that maybe this is more feasible if we think about this on a small scale, not something as big as a human?
Yeah, of course. But remembering that humans are actually just a collection of really small things put together, we're the combination of ourselves. And so, this is a process we could think of in our own building of these things as well. Little bits that add together to be a sum that's greater than the sum of the parts.
One last question, Duncan. Now, as you pointed out, energy is possibly going to be a big stumbling block among many. But what about just the properties of metals? I mean, most metals, if we go for a metal option, apart from mercury, it's going to have to be very hot, isn't it, for it to move, to reform. That's generally what we have to do. When we forge metals, we need to have a lot of heat. Is there any alloy that mercury could form, perhaps, which allows you to have metal forming a liquid and then a solid at room temperature?
Yeah, absolutely. So anybody who does soldering is aware of sort of low melting points. So individual pure metals are generally reasonably high melting points, but depending on the alloy that you get and how well the two metals mix together, they can be turning to liquid very close to room temperature. So I think you can do a gallium indium, take the two metals, mix them together, and if they're in the right ratio, they form a liquid because of the way that they pack together. So what we have
they've
is
then got to reform a solid once you got it all back together again, or else Terminator 1000 is going to just fall on the ground and become a puddle.
Yeah, so liquids are sort of an interesting place. They're materials that have too much energy to settle down into a structure, but not enough energy to fly apart and be separate molecules. And if you're just near that boundary of solid to liquid, in water's case, -1 degree to +1 degree, it might not take much to just tip you from one side to the other. So if you carefully create an alloy that has just the right composition so that it's always hovering just above or just below being a solid, then you might be able to do something.
But as he said, Duncan, is it more likely we'd find something that has the right properties that's a polymer rather than a metal alloy?
Well, as I said, with plastics, polymers, there's just so much possibility. There's so many things and so many ways that we can combine things together that I think, there's a lot of scope there. I think there's a lot more capability to do something really interesting in the polymer space.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sci Fi, Sci Fact, hosted by me, Brian Crump, produced by Andrew Robertson, and of course, made possible thanks to the incredible knowledge of those brilliant scientists at the MacDiarmid Institute. You can find more episodes of Sci Fi, Sci Fact on the RNZ podcast page. RNZ podcasts are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or pretty much wherever you might find your podcasts. And make sure to follow us so you don't miss out on any new episodes.